Hey, FIFO here. And I, as a UX designer, I use Figma every day. But have you ever thought of building your own interfaces for your digital tools directly in Houdini? Let me show you some tricks. The more you get into Houdini, the more likely it will be that you build your own tools with your own custom interfaces. Today, I brought you the 4 most common use cases I came across. The promote parameters, create parameters in Vex, control a network via a Null Object, or create your own Houdini digital asset. So without further ado, let's jump into the first use case, the promote parameters, and let's master this parameter interface. In here, I prepared already a little setup with just a line that I am going to resample, and I apply this curveview attribute. And in here, I want to displace my line according to the curveview attribute. So it sits at the world origin, and the more it goes to the top, the more it can jiggle around. So I created this point VOP in here that basically does this already. I take my position, I add a turbulent noise to that position, I multiply it by the curveview attribute, and I add it back into the position, and this is what it's going to create. But now it would be super cool that I'm not always going all the time inside this node and changing parameters in here, to have those parameters accessible on this one level above. So for that, we can come inside and either create certain attributes, like for example a ramp parameter, and I put it in here after the curveview in order to remap it. And let's say I want to create a spline ramp out of it. So if I hit U and jump up one level, you see we created an interface element. So I can come in, change, for example, the handle types to a B-spline. So if I add a new one, I can dial in this kind of fall off, more granular and more fine. But what about the rest? It would be super cool to change the noise type, the frequency, amplitude and roughness. So for this, you can either come in here and, for example, for the roughness, you hit your mouse wheel and say promote parameter, and it gets this little flag. Or what I like to do, sometimes I work on my MacBook and I don't have access to a middle mouse. So you basically come into the parameter interface here. And for example, for the noise type, you click this little cogwheel down here and you have access to the same options. So let's hit promote parameter, promote parameter, promote parameter, and you guessed it, promote parameter. Let's jump out. And you see we have access to all of those elements in here. We can change the noise type, for example, to the simplex noise. We can up the frequency or lower it drastically. And by this, we have maximum control over this node without the need to dive inside and change things inside those nodes here. Okay, and let's jump into the second use case, to create the parameters inside Vex. For this, I already prepared a little setup here. It's just an example, but we can use this method throughout a lot of systems. So in here, I have a bunch of spheres that gets a certain color value assigned. And downstream here, I have this group by expression node where I basically select all the spheres that have a color value below 0.5. So if I highlight it, you see I have these spheres selected. I could always come in and change this kind of value in here, but it would be super handy to just have a slider to drag it, and we automatically select whatever threshold we set in the slider. In order to do this, let's create a point wrangle. And we name this create threshold. And in here we will create, bear with me, it's just a single line of Vex code to set up our slider. So I want to have a float attribute. So I will say f add threshold equals, and if you're not familiar anymore with like floats, integers, and in general attribute types, you can head over to the YouTube channel and find this attributes and groups tutorial where I go into much more detail. Okay, so f at threshold equals, and we create a channel F, so it's a channel float attribute. Then we set brackets and say threshold, so the label name goes in here, and we close the line like this. We have no error, and once I hit this little icon down here, we create our threshold slider, which I can then use to adjust to my liking. Let's say 0.5. So now I have this threshold, and down here in the geometry spreadsheet, we see we have it written as an attribute. So now I can come into my group. The color diffuse is smaller than 0.5, but I can say the color diffuse is smaller than this threshold, like this. Let's check if it's working. We highlight this node and then we use the slider. Perfect. So like this, we can dynamically select certain objects in our stream and split it accordingly. Cool. That was it for method number 2. Let's jump into number 3. For number 3, you guessed it, I also prepared a little setup which divides this given box randomly, and you can create also certain parts as wireframes. And therefore, I basically used the same setup that I was just explaining. But now it would be super cool to have kind of slider for the seed in order to change the appearance of this box, and I can generate multiple versions of it. And I don't want to create for each and every node that we're going to influence a slider element that I then reference. So it would be good to just create that once. And therefore I like to create a null object that I place outside my node stream, and I call this controller. Usually I like to give it this round shape and also a different color. You can also apply a sticker. And choose for the randomization controller. In here, we need a slider, and you see we have no vex field to set this one up. But what I can do is, first of all, I could do a right click, say parameters and channels, and say edit parameter interface. But the most common way is this cogwheel up here, and then it becomes the first option. Let's click this, and we are granted with this interface, and here is where the fun starts. On the left side we have all those interface elements of Houdini, and on the right side we have our node, which is, except of this root thing here, can say make it invisible, completely empty. And now we can freely pick from this list. Let's say we take this integer here and we drag it over, and then we can start to adjust these kind of elements. So I want to have a seed parameter, and the label that is basically shown in the interface should also be the seed. For the size, I want a range from 0 to, let's say, 10,000, and let's hit apply and accept for now. And we have the seed slider. So I can now come in, say copy parameter, and for example, let's go into the color, and there's already a seed value. So let's right click on it and say paste relative reference. And now once I click on it, it will always toggle between the expression and the actual numerical number. So if I change this to a different thing, you can already see it working. But once I highlight this, you see those numbers, they match perfectly. Okay, and now I could come in and say even down here, the seed for this color, I could paste relative reference. And if I want to have a different seed, I just add some random numbers, and it gives me a different kind of option. Also in here, we have an wire amount. So that would be cool to adjust the amount of wires and drive this parameter globally. So what I can do is I come back to my controller, enter the edit parameter interface again. And this time I take a float because we want to have a number between, and let's say this is the wire amount. Let's choose the same thing for the label, but without a underscore. And let's say it's a range between 0 and 1. Accept, copy it, come into our amount slider, and then paste the relative reference in here. Currently it's on 0, so let's crank this up. We can make everything wireframe, or just half of it, but maybe let's go with 60%. Okay, One of the last tricks I want to show you in here, you can see I branched out this kind of wireframe section, and it would be cool to have it as an optional area of my interface. So what I'm going to do, I added the parameter interface again, and if I scroll down, I have this toggle element down here. So if I put this in and I name it create wireframes, same for the label without the underscore, and it's a Boolean operation. So it's either toggled on, which means its value is 1, or it's toggled off, which is basically equal to a 0. What we can now leverage is to drive this switch node down here. So if I copy the toggle parameter and come into the switch node and I paste the relative reference, it will mimic our wireframe. You see now it's toggle on and it equals 1, and if I toggle it off, it equals to 0. And in order to declutter our interface here, I would like that all the elements that are related to creating those wireframes, they will just show up once I selected the wireframes. In that way, it is way more intuitive for a user. How do we set this up? In here, you see I created the name of this element. So let's copy that, and inside our wire amount slider, we have this disable when and hide when option. And the syntax here is pretty simple. So we create those wavy brackets and we say our name of the element that we created equals 0, which basically is once the toggle is turned off, then also disable this option. Once I hit apply, you see now it's just disabled, but we want to take the exact same snippet of code and place it in the hiding section, hit apply, and then it's completely gone. Once I toggle it on, this expression will equal 1, so it won't be true anymore, and we see this kind of wire mount. And with this kind of options, you can really build some complex interfaces in here. Let's hit apply and accept. What if I want to switch between this box or a sphere maybe, or another box that is very long? And now coming into our interface, and we will select the ordered menu. This will be our top one, and this is like input, and the label will be input. And apply, and this creates this little drop down menu here. I would not call it ordered menu in UX design. This is more like a drop down. And in the menu section here, we can create certain values. So let's say our first value is 0 and the label will be box. Okay. The second one is 1, which is the second input of the switch. So 0 selects the first, 1 the second, and 3 the third. So let's mimic this in here. So the number 1 equals the sphere and the number 2 equals the long box. Cool. Let's hit apply and accept. And in our interface now, I can come in and select different kind of inputs. But of course, I will need to copy this input, copy parameter, and paste it as a relative reference inside the switch node. Let's highlight the last node here. I don't know if this setup makes so much sense on the sphere, but let's say we switch to the sphere, and you see we can still use all of our other elements on this input geometry or change it to the long box. Okay, so last but not least, let's jump into the most elaborate use case by creating your own Houdini digital assets. Think of them like a container that wraps your entire network, so all the nodes, parameters, interface elements, into a single reusable tool. Once you saved it, it shows up in your shelf tools or in the tab menu, and you can reuse it in your setups or even give it to other artists. But how do we create it? You can see in here, I also created this controller. We have a couple of more sliders in here, but let's say I want to wrap all this into a digital asset. What I could do is I can take everything and say actions collapse to subnet. Now in here, let's call this Box Subdiv. We have everything that we just built inside here. It just ended an output node, and we have those 4 input nodes that equal those 4 connection dots of the node. So let's jump inside. Let's connect the first input this input. So in order for the user to plug in whatever geometry they like. And now we need to create our interface on this kind of level. Okay, so inside here, let's say edit parameter interface. Let's hit up one level and let's say edit parameter interface. And we can just copy. Let's say these are invisible and say paste. Yeah, and like this. Accept, close this, and now we just need to copy this parameter, paste the relative reference in here, take the seed, paste the relative reference in here, the iteration. So we just relinking them, coming for the checkbox. Once we hit apply, we access the last interface element. And like this, everything is fully linked and controllable from this section up here. So let's say we have this kind of box element. We can switch it to the normal box. Perfect. And in order to create a digital asset out of it, we can simply say right click, create digital asset. We can define the name of our asset, the location where it's going to be saved, and once we hit create, it will come up with this dialog where we can adjust everything regarding our digital asset. In the basic tab, we can select an icon. Luckily, I prepared one for that. Can be just a basic PNG. You have access to all the parameters again. You can do some final adjustments, add some nice folders, for example, where you then can make different kind of tab structures or add some separators in between in order to give the interface a little bit more breathing room. Of course, you should always add some labels or some little messages. This is a tool tip in order for the users to understand your intentions better. Once you're happy with everything, you can just hit accept and it will save your digital asset. And you see you have this super cool little icon, then the Box Subdiv, like this. Actually, I built a more elaborate tool. It's called Box Random Subdivision. So once you highlight it, you have a little bit more control over everything. You have 2 layers of subdivisions then you can add. You can of course also play with the seed here, and again, these are the folders that I was mentioning before. You can jump over to the wireframes, create those wireframes, give it a width for the rendering, a seed and an amount. Let's go with our trusty 70% again, like this. Of course, you can easily apply a color scheme to it. The same for our colored boxes. You can generate some UVs. As my hint is telling you, it will take a while to compute. And once I click in here in the interface, you can see this used all the tricks that I showed you before with some nested folder structures. And I would say now you have all the tools in your box in order to create such interfaces and tools. But if this was too much work for you, you can jump over to my Gumroad page where I basically made this file available, and you can see some preview renders in here. Maybe you can imagine a bit better which kind of scenes you can create with that. Over here on the general page, you can also find the box bundle, where this tool is combined with my advanced voxel HDA, which also can be used to create this super cool voxel sculptures. You can even generate like a hull around it that is animated. I would be glad if you check it out. It supports the channel, and I really hope you found this tutorial useful. There you go. Now you know how to build interfaces in Houdini. I hope to see you in the next one. Stay curious.